Hi, I'm Gary Hamill. I'm here with my colleague, Michele Zanini, and welcome to the New Human Movement. Again, a fantastic guest we're going to be talking with today. Jeff Edmondson is the Executive Director of Community Mobilization at Ballmer Group, and it oversees its support of community-based initiatives across the country. Before that, Jeff led an amazing effort starting in Cincinnati, Southern Ohio, Northern Kentucky, an amazing effort aimed at improving educational outcomes, at keeping kids in school, getting them through high school, into college. And this was StriveTogether. It was a partnership of many different organizations who were tackling this very, very difficult, complicated problem of educational achievement. And ultimately, the model that they built there would spread to more than 65 communities across the United States. So the reason we're talking to Jeff today is because clearly those of us who care about building a different sort of organization, who care about empowering people and pulling down bureaucracy and unleashing human capacity at work, we understand this is the challenge not just for a single organization, but there are many players that kind of keep that old management, that old bureaucratic model in place, business schools and investors and regulators and policymakers and CEOs. So it is, tackling this problem of building human-centric organizations really is a multi-dimensional problem. And we have a lot to learn from those few and rare efforts like StriveTogether, where they've really done this sort of collective problem solving at scale. So Jeff, thanks a ton for joining us. That's the setup, and we're so happy you're here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's really an interesting concept, and I appreciate the opportunity to weigh in.
So Jeff, let's ask you. I'm sure you've told this story many times, but if you could talk to our listeners, our viewers, and tell them a little bit about how StriveTogether got started, both the problem you were trying to solve, but what was different about the way you tackled this? Because obviously a lot of conversation about the challenges of raising high school graduations, educational treatment, but why did this speak to your heart? And then what did you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, just to start at the end, why it connected to my heart, certainly rooted in my family. I grew up with my mom, who was led a Habitat for Humanity in a small chapter in a small mining town in Pennsylvania. I had just and my stepdad was a minister. So I was really just in the middle of social issues through my entire upbringing. And I ended up going into the Peace Corps right out of college. And I was in what's considered one of the more, I think, stereotypical Peace Corps experiences. It was fish farming in the Central African country of Gabon. And it is really, it was an amazing experience. I ended up staying 4 years. But what was fascinating about it and how it connects to Strive in Cincinnati, or Strive partnership in Cincinnati, is that Gabon is 90 at the time, was 90% rainforest. This is over 20 years ago now. But it's still, a high percentage of their geographic area is covered by rainforest, and they really have 4 seasons: a long rainy season, a long dry season, a short rainy season, and a short dry season. And the program had been in Gabon, the fish farming program had been in Gabon for over 15 years, but there were really only 5 to 10 significant farms of any sort, because every rainy season the rains would come in and just wipe out any of the walls that were created to make these fish farms. And what became very clear was that when you talked to the local Gabonese about what they thought would be most useful for the United States to be helping them with, it was not fish farming. The decision had been made to do fish farming by somebody in Washington, D.C., because the fish farming program had worked in Congo, which is a neighboring country. But Congo is as different from Gabon as Massachusetts is from Texas. They are completely different environments.
But what you're saying is you don't see all those differences when you're sitting at the center somewhere.
Yeah, and you can't see those differences, if you're not just immersed with the individuals. So to make a very long story short, the reason I stayed the extra 2 years was to work with the Gabonese and convince the Peace Corps to switch the programming to animal husbandry, because the Gabonese didn't know how to raise animals in a concerted way, and so we actually were successful and we changed that. But fast forward a few years, I ended up working in one of the largest public high schools in Washington, D.C., and I saw almost the exact same problem. Inside that school, there were dozens of nonprofit programs operating, but none of them were coordinated. Very few of them actually met the most pressing needs of the families that they were trying to serve. And so right here within our borders, not on the other side of the ocean, we were facing the exact same problem. Decisions were being made about what types of supports, what types of services to deliver that were completely disassociated from the individuals that they were trying to serve. And it just occurred to me that while I totally bought into this idea that we as a country needed to make sure that those who have, through systemic racism, systemic bias, been left behind far too often in the development and growth of our economy, that we needed social services. We needed to do them in a much smarter, a much more intentional way, and frankly, in a way that is centered on the needs of those individuals.
But Jeff, if I could just draw a little parallel there with what I think a lot of our listeners experience in their own organizations. Whatever the problem is, whether it's getting people more engaged, getting innovation up, what they see is a lot of disconnected programs made by people often quite a long ways away from the real problem, well-intentioned, but maybe not, doesn't really dovetail with the reality on the ground, not connected together, and maybe not going after root causes. So I think that's what you're describing. That's what you felt working in that school system.
That's exactly right. And then fast forward again, about 5 to 7 years later, we're in Cincinnati. There had been race riots in 2001. A few programs were created in response. About 3 or 4 years later, a lot of the community leaders came together and said we had not actually gotten at the root causes of what was behind those riots, and one of the at the time, the head of the community college stood up, and he said, to your exact point, folks, we are program rich and system poor. And as long as we essentially take a programmatic approach to solving systemic problems, we're never going to get there. And that is really what catalyzed the Strive partnership in Cincinnati, Ohio. There were tons of assumptions being made by leaders in the community about what was needed to get at those root cause issues. And very few of them were grounded in what those that were truly struggling in the community knew was necessary in order to get better results.
So that's a extraordinary and I think many people would resonate with problems of that sort that are complex, that aren't going to be solved by a mishmash of programs. But I guess all of these different programs and all these different constituencies, how do you start to bring all of these people together around a common cause? That seems immensely difficult. So maybe take us almost through a little bit of the genealogy here, or a little bit of the sequencing. How did you start to get people to kind of start to connect the dots and work together on this, rather from all their various institutional perspectives and roles?
Yeah. So first off, I just got to say that the collective impact article that was written back in 2011 was wonderful in many ways, because I do think it got to the essence of what we were trying to do. But what it also was a sanitized version of reality, right? It did not happen in as clear cut a way as they captured based on their interviews with some of the local players.
And by the way, this is an interview, or this is an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, if I'm right.
That is exactly
and
right.
we'll make sure we put a link in there if people want to go read. But that was a kind of a story of what you've done. But
Right.
you're saying
It was an
maybe a little
article
sanitized.
called, yeah, exactly. It was an article called Collective Impact. And, it was really powerful and made waves within the sector for a while. What I think the disservice that it did in many ways was it made it sound like the question that you asked, how did you get from here to there, essentially? The truth is we failed a lot. The first thing that we did was try to organize the community around programmatic areas, right? So after school programming or health services in schools or things of that sort. And what we quickly realized, and it was again, one of the leaders in the community stood up, the head of the United Way, a guy named Rob Reifschneider. He stood up and he said, listen, I think we're all going in the same direction, but I don't think we are. When I say education, I have a mental model in my head of what I think is needed. And we all assume that everybody has that exact same picture in their head. But in fact, we don't all know that we're going in the same direction. We all may think we are, but we're not. And so the first step that we needed to take after many failing forward moments, right, of getting things wrong and having to pick ourselves back up and try to organize people, probably the first, and what to this day I think is the most important lesson from the work that Strive Partnership and then StriveTogether did, is that you have to agree on your destination, and it needs to be crystal clear how to measure it. This is not rocket science. There's all kinds of business review articles about what gets measured gets done. But I think in the social sector, we have a tendency in particular to make assumptions about that. And I would even say in the private sector, the assumption is that the goal for everybody involved, everybody in a given company, is always going to be about profit or return, where if you were to really ask the workers in a given company what was most important to them, and actually I think the Business Roundtable just acknowledged this, it might be that the company is giving back to the community in specific ways. So if you're really going to get to what you all have, I believe, been asserting, which is more of a human-centered economy, I think you've got to ask the people in the community, in the company, whatever the construct may be, what is the goal that they all would say they want to achieve, and how would we know that we got there? And it was when we actually took the time to nail that down with the community partners to make sure that we were actually talking about the same destination. That's when we started to make progress. So it was things like kindergarten readiness. Every family wanted their child to be kindergarten ready. They did not want to feel like when they dropped their kid off at school that they were already, 50 yards behind in a 200-yard race. They definitely wanted to make sure kids were on target developmentally in reading, and they wanted to graduate from high school. But we had to have community conversations to get rallied around that point, and that's when we could feel confident that everybody that was involved was going to work together and get to that common true north.
Can I ask you, Jeff, on that, if you could paint us a practical picture of how you got all these disparate communities coalesced around a common set of objectives and diagnoses, right, that kind of precede the objective setting. How did it sounds enormously complicated and time consuming. I'd love to hear how you got that together.
Well, I mean, again, there was a huge failing forward moment on that. The first thing we did once we realized we needed to do it, which took us some time already, was we got a bunch of really smart data people in the room. I mean, really smart data people, the ones that everybody even trusted, right? And they came up with a list of I think it was about 20 metrics. And they said, these are the definitive metrics that everybody would want to get to. And we had done a bunch of meetings with folks, and we presented those. And it frankly fell like a dead weight. Nobody bought in. People were like, here's you folks, mostly white folks, dictating for our community what it is that we need to see happen. And frankly, the whole thing could have fallen apart there. But if it wasn't for a few leaders that stepped up and said, hey, give us one more chance at this. And what we did is we went back and we said, okay, what would be the criteria for picking outcomes? And instead of listening to just the data experts, we talked to parents. We said, what would make you trust the data, right? If we said we wanted to have something measurable and they said, well, I'd want it to come from a trusted source, right? Well, I'd want to know that it wasn't just completely random, meaning taken one time and didn't make sense to people. I'd want to know that what it actually meant. Like one of the local CEOs wanted one of the ultimate goals to be the number of kids that were in international baccalaureate classes. Nobody had any clue what that meant, right? So it was like, what are these criteria for actually picking what the metrics would be? And then we got in a room with residents and parents. We went to churches. We went everywhere and said, what do you think the metrics might be? And then very transparently, we filtered all those metrics. There were over 100 of them through those filters, through those criteria, right? And very quickly, what came out of that was a group of about 10 to 12 outcomes that you could actually measure, that came from a trusted source, that people understood. I think there's a guy named Mark Friedman that has an article that talks about what some of these criteria might be. We didn't know about that till later. But it was, but essentially the community itself had to go through the process of understanding how the metrics were selected so that they felt comfortable, right? That the destination was not chosen from them, but it actually came from their voice.
That's great. Can I ask you, Jeff, one question? I'm curious, how many of the original metrics from the data wizards ended up on the set of metrics that you ended up embracing as a community? That
is a great question. And the answer is most. The answer is most. Okay. It wasn't what the content was. It was the process. And if you were to ask me about what's another key lesson from this work, it's that the process matters. And frankly, most of the collective impact work, up until I really left StriveTogether about 3 or 4 years ago, and the woman that has taken my place, who was one of the co-founders of StriveTogether with me, and I think has done just a phenomenal job, Jennifer Blatz, she was the one that stood up and just said, we have to start making sure that we are not just reinforcing the powers that be, frankly, the bureaucratic powers that be within a given community. We have to start empowering parents, family members, community members to not only have a voice in picking those metrics, but having a voice in figuring out what are the interventions that are really having impact, and making sure that when a community is advocating for policies, right, to support those things that are having impact, it isn't the things that the powers that be that exist right now assume are having impact. And even if the data says they're having some, it has to be the things that actually meet parents and families' needs. And now they've started to lift that up. So I can give you a great example of this. This was a while ago, but in San Antonio, this was actually a really critical moment in the development of StriveTogether. One of the outcomes that they had picked, the partnership there, at the time it was called P16 Plus. It's now, I think, one of the more promising partnerships in the country. It's called the UP Partnership. But the partners there had looked at the data in real time, and attendance was terrible. It was horrible, right? The school attendance had just plummeted for some reason. And all the powers that be at the time got together and said, we're going to do a billboard campaign, because our assumption is that people have forgotten that going to school is important, right? So they got ready to start this billboard campaign, but right before they were about to pay millions of dollars, they showed the data to a group of parents. And the parents looked at the data and immediately just said, oh yeah, that's because in the budget cuts last year for the school district, they made it so you had to live a full mile from the school, not just a half mile from the school, in order to get a bus. So they said, if you look at the data, I bet you most of the kids that are not showing up or tardy, they actually live right near the school, but they're not getting there because there's no bus, and they may not feel safe, or they may not be getting up on time, who knows? But if you expand the busing boundaries back out to where they need to a mile from the school, I bet you people will show up. Lo and behold, they paid for that, which was a fraction of the cost of a billboard campaign, And guess what happened? Attendance went up. So the idea of using data real time, not 5-year double-blind randomized controlled trials, evaluations that, by the time they get released are antiquated in nature in far too many cases. Now, there's a role for those. But that's not what we're talking about here. What was key was saying, okay, if we know our true north is early grade reading and high school graduation, and we know kids need to be in school in order to get there, let's look at the data in real time right now, and let's let the parents analyze it, right? In your case, let's let the workers analyze it and tell us what it's really saying, because if we do that, chances are we're going to come up with a better intervention.
So, Jeff, you've gotten folks to kind of get a shared scoreboard, something we can all agree we need to aim at. But as McKinley was saying a moment ago, there's also a diagnostic phase, right? Like why? Now, you described one instance where you could kind of trace that back and say why. But obviously, if you're looking at high school graduation rates, let's say across the city, there are many things that are driving that. So can you talk a little bit about the next couple of stages as you built these partnerships, starting in Cincinnati? How did you get like an honest assessment of what's going on behind this? Why? What explains the poor performance? And then what was kind of literally the mechanisms you used to bring people together and to get them to kind of solve against that?
So again, I just need to keep repeating it because it's so important. We failed a lot, right? We made assumptions. We included our racial biases, our all kinds of biases into trying to figure out what those root causes were. And we try things, right? We thought maybe creating I know that we spent a ton of time on developing a catalog of all the available programs, somehow thinking that if we just published that catalog, that all of a sudden parents would just, show up. It wasn't that they needed a catalog. They just needed somebody they trusted to help them figure out how to navigate the system. But the answer to your question is this. We partnered with GE Aviation. GE Aviation is one of the largest Fortune 500s in Cincinnati, Ohio. Very few people know, but Cincinnati is actually blessed with quite a few. And we got a loaned executive from Procter & Gamble who came over and said, I'm going to try to help figure out how to get Six Sigma that GE Aviation used to help the Strive partnership in Cincinnati have a consistent process for assessing what are the root causes. And we got these trainers from GE Aviation and all that, and got them to train up some school district leaders and got them to train up some of the nonprofit leaders. And by the end of a year, pretty much everybody was scared to death. And they were scared to death because if anybody that's listening or you are familiar with Six Sigma uses terms like failures, right? It uses terms that in a social sector setting just simply won't work. The method made sense because if you do a rigorous Six Sigma process where you're actually looking at the data and you're intentionally trying to, figure out what's happening in the system, it can make great sense. But the language of Six Sigma was terrible. So a colleague of mine at Strive Partnership and then StriveTogether, actually, a guy named Colin Groth, he actually heard about at Cincinnati Children's Hospital a group called the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And the guy that founded the Institute for Healthcare Improvement essentially took the concepts of a Six Sigma and made them manageable for the social sector. So they'd been applying it. They'd been applying a continuous improvement methodology, that's what they call it, in the social sector for about 20 or 30 years. And what we realized was that the way that they did key driver diagrams, to use another business school term, I think, they did key driver diagrams where they would take that outcome and then they would look very intentionally and work with parents and practitioners and community members and others to say, what are the actual drivers that are keeping us from realizing that result? And then, what are the actual interventions that you have seen work against those drivers, right? So an example driver could be, let's just go back to San Antonio. A key driver of attendance is transportation, right? Well, how are you going to get to school? Well, you could either take public transportation, You can have somebody at home take you, or you can take a school bus. What of those three really, really works, right? What of those interventions actually gets people to school? And then let's figure out how to maximize for that and then fill in the gaps. And essentially what we did was we took this methodology that the Institute for Healthcare Improvement had created called the Breakthrough Series Collaborative and started playing with it a little bit. We introduced, and now StriveTogether has interjected human-centered design into the process. They've incorporated something from Annie Casey Foundation called Results Count. That's all about change management and making sure that when people figure out what the root cause is, they don't just reject it because they don't like it. And they've kind of come up with a methodology that works in the social sector that brings everybody that needs to be there, as many as you can, to look at that outcome and then honestly, authentically use both quantitative and qualitative data to figure out what are those key drivers and then what are the interventions. And that really is a powerful process. I will say that now there's another group called Community Solutions that focuses on homelessness. And they try to get every community to zero on homelessness. And they use the exact same process, even though they'd never talked to StriveTogether before.
So if I understand this, Jeff, let me just catch up with you. If I understand this, so you looked at multiple tools, you adjusted ones that were going to be right for you. But the heart of it was, looking at some of these broad objectives, then working down into more detailed metrics, what really drives that outcome. So disaggregating that down into it's how far you live from schools, the availability of buses, whatever it may be, but getting that next level of data. But as you then say, okay, let's solve for that. I have this picture of you bringing a lot of different constituencies together in one room. Was that the case? Were people kind of all looking at the same data set, all looking at the same problem? Parents, teachers, businesses, school administrators,
Yep.
Talk to us a little bit about the mechanics. And then I think there was also, did you have something called war rooms that were out in some of the schools? Maybe just take us a little bit more through the mechanics as you've unpacked that. Then how did you actually get this shared problem solving to happen?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. In the StriveTogether world, we call them student success networks. And so the outcome was always a student outcome. It wasn't an adult outcome, right? It wasn't about whether the adults were happy for this, since it was education. It was about what was going to happen with the students. And then you brought into the same room the practitioners primarily, and this was a mistake we made. We brought in the practitioners primarily alone to help us go through that process, right? Use this Institute for Healthcare Improvements methodology to get there. What we learned over time was that you also had to have the students in the room. You also had to have the families in the room. Frankly, you also needed the policymakers in the room because you needed them to buy into the process as well. And you had to bring everybody along. Now, was everybody always in that room? You called it a war room all the time? Nope. But you tried to get as many of them and as many touch points along the way as possible so that when you did land on something that was already happening, hopefully, that was already happening, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, because that's what we do in the social sector all the time, right? We just start from scratch. We think it's never been done before. We spend 3 years making all the mistakes that somebody else has already made. What we were trying to do was just pinpoint what was actually working in Cincinnati, or what was working in San Antonio or Dallas or Salt Lake City or Memphis. What was already working, and how could we actually improve upon that? And if you had all those people in the same room, in that war room, I think a lot of people don't like the war analogies, so maybe we need to go in the impact room, whatever we want to call it. But you get in that room, and everybody knows that when you go in there, you're going to have to somewhat set your biases aside. So, one of the things we realized, let's just go with early grade reading for a minute. You could bring in the researchers on early grade reading, and there'd be two camps. There'd be the folks that think phonics worked, right? And phonics is the thing. And so this strategy has to be phonics. And then there's another group that thinks whole language works. And they get in there and they'd be like, that's whole language. And in fact, around after school programming at one point and early grade reading, we brought together a group of after school programs for a full year, and they tried to define what a good after school program was. And at the end of the year, we said, okay, who can show us that their work aligns with these things and is actually moving early grade reading? And not one person said yes, right? They had come up with a definition that didn't even exist. And so what we learned was that was a wasted year. What we should have been doing was looking at what they're doing right now. What are they doing right now? And is it contributing to the result that we wanted to see or not? And then get the parents in there and say, what works for you? Get the students in there. Is this fun for you? Is this how you want to learn? Get the policymakers in there. You're funding this way. Would it be easier to fund it this way? Have those discussions and then emerge from there, not with something brand new, but with something that is a different way of operating every single day, right? And that's really what the gold standard is here. It's how can we operate differently every day to achieve a better result and frankly address a lot of the biases and issues that we may have essentially been unintentionally reinforcing all along the way.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation. There's more of it to come. I just wanted to take a moment to thank Haier, the world's largest appliance maker and a global leader in the Internet of Things, for underwriting the costs of producing this interview. It's great to work with a partner who is so deeply committed to building organizations that elicit and deserve the very best that human beings can give. Now, back to our conversation.
So not only using the community and the users in identifying the measures, but just making sure that they're engaged in evaluating progress and pivoting where it's needed, right? That's just so important. We often forget that. We get the customer involved at the beginning of the process, and then go away. We'll come back to you with a finished product, right? And so you need to kind of overcome that temptation you might have to keep things simple for you, but ultimately suboptimal. But I wanted to ask you something related to this, Jeff, because you said people come in with their preconceived ideas, notions, and so on, and I would imagine that overcoming parochialism is a real challenge, right? And again, it's like not evil parochialism is well-meaning in most cases, but nonetheless it's there. And I'm reminded as I was reading the StriveTogether experience, or an account of the experience, is that there were cases when resources had to shift in light of the data, right? So I think private schools are better, preschools are better at preparing kids for kindergarten than public preschools, and therefore there was a shift in resources at the level of the city from right to private schools, and I'm sure that wasn't an easy thing to do. So how do those conversations happen, and how do they come about in a way that was productive and not full of friction?
They were often full of friction. They were. I will tell you that one of my mentors, the woman who actually made a lot of this happen in Cincinnati, she was the president of the university at the time, and she's truly one of the most innovative university presidents, completely breaks every mold you could ever imagine. Her name's Nancy Zimpher. She actually sat me down at one point and said, Jeff, we're making progress, we're feeling good, but you are spending 90% of your time on the 10% of people that will not come along. And I was literally spending enormous amounts of time trying to convince people that were completely locked in their parochialism, frankly, to get them to come along. And she said, why don't you just spend more time with those of us that do want to come along, right? And what that meant was meaning that sometimes people had to just step away. Sometimes people had to say, hey, this is not for me. Frankly, they may have had a very good reason because it was going in a way that wasn't consistent with their interests. But it wasn't my job as the person who was coordinating this whole effort to try to keep them in. I certainly wanted to let them know the door was always open. But if they didn't necessarily like the direction, we had to be willing actually to let them go for the moment, right? And again, the door was always open. They could come back, but essentially the courage at times to not have everybody come along, but to let people come along at the pace that they would. And similar to something, Gary, you said earlier about, how, or maybe, I don't know who asked the question, but it was like, how many of the outcomes were the same? A lot of them were the same. In this case, even people that went away, they came back. But you had to let the process unfold in a way that actually worked for them, right? And so I think that was a really tough lesson, was to say that once we start bringing in this broad set of constituents, those that start in the room may not be the ones that finish, but they're always welcome back.
But I mean, what you're describing, Jeff, is, whenever you're solving any difficult systemic problem, you have a lot of embedded orthodoxies. You have a lot of people who just by dint, not from ill will, as McKinley's saying, but just by dint of, being in one role for years, they're seeing only through a particular, perspective, the totality of the problem. And then, whatever change you come up with, it is sometimes going to work better for some than others, right? There's a price to be paid as you try to change something, and that price is not always symmetrical. Some people, it's going to be harder for me, and so how did you and you said, well, part of the strategy is, like, if you just don't get it, if you don't want to participate, we're just going to keep going, right? And I get that, but how in the process of connecting people together and getting them focused on it, how did you overcome some of the natural suspicion and the territorialism, the parochialism that just bedevils most such change programs?
Yeah, there's a concept out there called the recognition economy, where you start to lift up the people that are modeling the behavior that you need to see, right? And actually, in the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, they have this theory of let the leading edge lead. And far too often, we want to bring everybody to the norm rather than lifting up those that are modeling what you want to see happen, right? Modeling what could change a system. We pigeonhole it. We'll be like, yeah, but they're a little different. They're just over here. What we tried to do was lift up those exemplars and say, what made them different? And I have to say that one of those things that made them different was a leader who was committed to the concept of servant leadership. They were not committed to their ideology. They were not committed to exactly what it is that they thought was the best thing to occur. What they were interested in was the outcome. What they were interested in was the result. And I think business schools, frankly, and others that are out there that you referenced at the beginning that do training, one of the things that has to be taught is that leadership often is about letting go of your assumptions, right? Just back all the way to my story in Gabon. Somebody at the Peace Corps had to have the courage to say, even though we've been doing fish farming for almost 20 years in Gabon, maybe it actually doesn't meet the needs of the Gabonese. Somebody had to have enough courage to do that. That frankly is one of those leadership skills that can be taught, right? People think it's just innate. It is not. Can absolutely be taught. And part of what StriveTogether is doing now actually is going out and part of what Community Solutions, that other group, they teach people, not just that are leading these efforts, but they're trying to teach elected officials. They're trying to teach government agency heads. They're trying to teach nonprofit leaders that the pie can grow, right? If we all just accept that we're playing a role towards achieving a result, that we are not the sole solution in and of ourselves. And you can teach that. And I think it's going to be critical that in this concept of a more human-centered society, and certainly human-centered organizations, that people are able to let go a little bit of what they've assumed might be the answers and what they may hold on to dearly based on their own personal experience, but they may not be the right solution for everybody else.
Yeah. Well, it's you're echoing a point that we've heard in previous conversations that, in business education and a lot of leadership education development is based on the idea that the leader has to have all the answers, because otherwise, why would that person have all the power and the perks, right? And so deprogramming that is fundamental. And, at least in our experience, it's something that you teach, but you almost need to experience for yourself. Like, you got to basically act your way into a new way of thinking. And I was intrigued by one of the things you mentioned in a social, Stanford Social Innovation Review paper you wrote, which is that you mentioned experiential learning for leaders as one of the 4 preconditions, right, for building capabilities in communities. And I was hoping you could expand on that, Jeff. Like, how do you get people to see the light and behave differently and embrace this kind of new model of leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give an example, and it actually goes back to Nancy Zimpher, who was the president of the university. She actually stood up in a meeting with a bunch of her peers who were leading other systems, including higher ed systems, which is hard for higher ed leaders to do, but also the heads of the United Ways and the philanthropies and the corporations. And she stood up and said, at the University of Cincinnati, we have a completion rate that at the time hovered around 50%. And she said, that's on me. That's on me. I'm going to take that one. I believe that we all play a role in it. But I can tell you that the University of Cincinnati is not doing everything it needs to do. And in fact, she pulled together all the college access and success programs on campus. And we thought we'd be able to fit everybody in the faculty club lounge, I think is what it was. It was a room that probably fit 20 people. So many programs and services showed up that it filled up the entire faculty club. She had no idea, right? I had no idea. None of us had any idea that there were that many people who had gotten grants or who had started a program or had done this. That was all focused on the same outcome. And she had no idea. What was different about Nancy, though, was she was willing to say that in front of her peers. And instead of her peers castigating her, putting it in the newspaper, creating headlines, she and her peers got to work on it, right? And they started to dig in and talk about the progress that they had been making over time. And I think creating an environment, an ecosystem of leadership within a given community or within a given company, where standing up and acknowledging that you weren't, you didn't do the right thing, that has to happen. Otherwise, people are going to be too afraid to break out of the norms and the status quo, right? Another example of that was at StriveTogether when we used to convene all the almost 70 plus communities, and at the end of it, we would hold what we called the Failing Forward Award, so that we would ask people to submit what were the things that happened in their community that did not work, what did they learn from it, and how did they get better. And that was the most, people never stay to the end of convenings. Everybody stayed to the end of this convening because everybody wanted to hear, right? And there was one famous one of the best leaders I've ever worked with in my life is a guy named Bill Krim in Salt Lake City. He runs the partnership there. It's called Promise Partnerships. And he told a story that literally brought the house down, and it involved all the key leaders in the community. Bill did not get fired, right? They did end up wasting a little bit of money at the time, but they saved a ton of money and got much better results the next year, right? And it was an environment where it was okay to try things, to fail forward, and then show how you're going to get better. And I think that's absolutely critical in order for these new kinds of systems to emerge that really empower the individuals that work within them.
There's almost a paradox, I think, here, Jeff, and please correct me if you see this differently. Clearly we're talking about big systemic problems. And yet I kind of almost have the sense that while you have to recognize that it's systemic, while you need all the different players there and all the different pieces, you actually can't solve a systemic problem systemically, right? You have to just start where you are, find what's working, move to the next thing. But I think there's this tendency often to no, let's just step back. Let's get all the experts. Let's look at this whole thing in entirety and design the whole new thing, whatever we think that thing is, with all the various pieces and components, then somehow to make that happen. And so, your approach is at once very ambitious, but also very modest. Is that a fair thing to say?
It's an absolutely fair thing to say, and I'm smiling because I will never forget one of these meetings. We were fortunate early on to get some funding support when we were trying to start up the national network called StriveTogether from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I happened to go visit them for whatever reason it was, and get a few minutes to sit down with the vice president that was supporting the work. And she said, I've read through a lot of what has been written about you or what you all have written. I think it kind of comes down to this for me. And she said, everybody's talking about systems change, but systems are made up of people. So if the people change, the systems change. And I will tell you that I had never thought of it that way. I mean, but as soon as she said it, it was one of those moments where you're like, yes, that is exactly right. And we love in our sector, in the social sector again, to talk about systems change. But all that is individuals, right? It is made up of individuals who make decisions about what they're going to do every day. And if they are willing to change how they operate, that's when real meaningful change happens. But it is at the individual level, right, that happens, not at some mythical, misunderstood system level. It is truly built on the individual.
But what you're saying is, because we've always, McKinley and I, we've always looked at these challenges of change. There's an individual aspect of it where my mindset, my beliefs, my perspectives need to change, and there's an institutional aspect to it where I can change my mind, but if I go back in an institution where all the rewards and systems and structures drive me in a different direction, like I'll probably just give up because like I can't fight all of that. So these things are linked together. But what I hear you saying is that really deep system change starts with a long series of personal epiphanies where somebody says, yeah, I'm part of the problem, or yeah, this isn't working, or yeah, we need to get better at working together. And and you can't stop there. Then you have to go on and say, okay, therefore, what do we do? But I'm wondering if you could generalize, as you brought all these folks together, what were some of the aha moments that people had that unlocked for them the chance of together making a difference that they couldn't do kind of from their individual roles?
Well, I think that would be a whole nother hour to go through all the ahas. But I can tell you this one lesson, and I think it's a big deal, is that we far too often do professional development, do training, even do education at the individual level. What we need to realize that especially for companies or organizations, the training has to be done in teams. Because if you have one of those ahas, and you invariably do when you look at the numbers, when you try to do some sort of root cause analysis, when you actually take a critical eye to something that has been done the same way for maybe hundreds of years, the only way that that's going to land and change is if you do it in the context of a team. And so one of the insights from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement is that in almost every case, they train at least 5 people that will continue to work together in the same environment at the same time. And they have to also be from different roles. It can't be people that do the exact same thing, so that they start to recognize their interconnectivity and the value that each of them brings to the table. And so you will uncover aha after aha, but it will completely land flat and go nowhere if they don't have a support structure around them that makes sure that it's going to actually lead to something significant and meaningful.
So you need a unit that's big enough to go back and kind of do something.
Exactly.
Let me ask the last couple of questions. I know we're at the limits of your time, and then McKinley will bring us home. But 2 quick questions. The first is, you are implying, more than implying, you kind of talked about this, but maybe you can kind of put a line on this. You're implying a very different role for leaders, where they're not like the decision maker in chief, but they're really creating the conditions where people can come together and co-solve. Can you just say a bit more about that? You talked about the president of the University of Cincinnati, but how has all of this experience changed your personal definition of what a leader is? And then the second question, which I should have asked at the beginning, is like, what are the metrics of success? Like, can you tell us kind of what difference these Strive partnerships have actually made? Do you regard this now as a success, and in the communities is a success? So leaders, and then how you think about the success of StriveTogether.
Yeah, I mean, I would say on the leadership front, I may have my own personal philosophy, but do I live them every day? I would fall on the sword and say I do not, but I'm definitely trying. I mean, I would say the old Lao Tzu quote, right? That the best sign of a leader, and I'm butchering the exact quote here, but the best sign of a leader is that a group arrives and accomplishes something, and they believe they've done it all by themselves, right? That they didn't have a quote unquote leader that made it all happen. And I really do believe that that's what it's going to take. And whether or not we love Robert Greenleaf's servant leadership is the right term, I'm not sure. But the concept behind it, that is central to everything, right? To say I'm willing to lead at times, I'm willing to follow at times, but I will know that I have to vacillate between those two ranges in order to get to where we need to go. Let's see. And then your second question was, say one more time.
How do you think about the success of the whole network? I mean,
Yeah,
obviously
so,
this
I mean,
has spread. So
Yeah, I mean, I would say that StriveTogether I would say it's on its way to being a success, right? And the only reason is because you have these servant leaders in almost 70 communities across the country. You have a group like Community Solutions that has the Built for Zero network of over 80 communities across the country focused on homelessness instead of education. But in both of those networks, you have a critical mass. You have at least 15 to 20 communities that have realized measurable and sustained change on kindergarten readiness, right? Or on high school graduation, or on college completion. And they may not have realized success on every single metric across that entire continuum, but they have realized sustained success at least 2 or 3 points along the way, right? And that gives us hope. And frankly, that's what gets us to believe, okay, the individuals in that community are starting to come around to the shared goal and accept the role that they can play, and innovate on the role that they can play in order to get there. And so I would say it's definitely very encouraging. Is it there yet? Nope. But is it on the right path? I would say sometimes it sort of deviates off to the left and right, but it's getting there.
But a lot of the communities are seeing very positive results on these metrics. Is the important point.
So Jeff, maybe my last question for me, and I'm sorry we're running over, and let us know if you have to drop, but it'd be, and maybe it's kind of an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. So one could draw the parallel between, poor outcomes at the community level for education, for instance, and poor outcomes for people working in organizations. If you look, Gary alluded to some of these statistics earlier. I believe the fact that people are disengaged at work and remain so, and have the number is not getting any better despite all the hype about the new world of work and the like. Organizations are becoming increasingly sclerotic and incapable of innovating, and so on. And responding to trends like environmental problems, or even solutions like electric vehicles with decades of delay, right? So we have real issues in kind of corporate in the workplace, and there are a lot of different people who are coming up with or want to solve the problem and point to different solutions. It's the way investors treat the managers, so it's the way the managers are compensated, or it's the fact that we don't have enough a diverse enough group of employees, or it's the fact that employees don't have enough voice. And all these things are kind of true, but at least the impression that we're getting, and some of the other people that we've been speaking to over the last few weeks have also pointed to, is the fact that these are all like different parishes, back to the parochialism analogy we mentioned earlier. And they're all trying to move in the right direction, but there's like no coordination. There's no real kind of sense of a shared mission, certainly no real like reinforcement of activities and so on. So some of the same things you mentioned. So what would be your advice to all those who are really trying to humanize the workplace and create better and more resilient organizations? Like, what would you do to bring all these different disparate parties together?
Yeah, it's honestly, it goes right back to the very first lesson that we learned in Cincinnati. We all made the assumption that what success looked like, right, for each individual was exactly the same, right? That we all had that shared understanding. I think it's really important to revisit that question. And my gut is that when the Business Roundtable changed the purpose of corporations from being just about improving the bottom line to also about improving the lives of their employees and their communities, I'm betting that most of those employees, most of those people that are not happy, are happy because they may see the bottom line improving and they may even benefit a lot from it. But what they really care about is, how is their life getting better? How are they happier? as a result of being a part of this? How is their community? Can they see when they drive home a community that is thriving, where it's not just about them, it's about their neighbors, it's about the people that they may not even know, they may not even be able to relate to, but do they seem happy? Do they seem like they're thriving? I think it might be about going back and having those conversations. And frankly, the pause of the pandemic, I think the greatest, what will make me incredibly sad is if, say, we get through this and we're able to not worry about going and seeing our loved ones, or even going into public, and we go right back to the way we were, right? If we just go back to the way we were, that is not success. This was an opportunity for everybody to take a pause and maybe reflect on exactly the kind of question you just asked, and then figure out how, when we can get back together, how could we actually get people to define that common goal, to figure out what it is that makes us whole, not just as an individual, but as a team, and then figure out how to work against that. And I think if you can do that, there's a good chance that we'll end up at a destination, not just personally or even professionally, but as a society that gets us where we want to go.
I think that's super good advice, Jeff. And what you're suggesting, in response to McKitty's question, that is maybe one of the starting points is we need to come together to define, what makes the sort of organization that is worth working for, right? What sort of our organization would merit and deserve the very best that human beings can give? And I'm not sure. I mean, the very first little opening there is to say, well, maybe companies aren't just for shareholders. That's for sure true. But I think there's so much more work to be done about creating that collective sense of what sort of organizations do we want to build and how will we measure that. And so thank you for that challenge. We're going to take it on. I hope other people listening today will take it on. And there's so much we can learn. So if you haven't, if this is your first introduction to StriveTogether, we'll put some more links there. Go look at it. Think about how it could work with your organization. And Jeff, just thanks a ton for sharing all of that wisdom with us.
Hey, thank you for taking the time, and I look forward to learning more from all of your work.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.